record button. And we're above 30, so I feel like we're in a good place to start. So hello, for any of you who I don't know, I see lots of people who I recognize. My name is Jeff Hunt, direct the LabX program here at the National Academy of Sciences, and welcome to our monthly SciEngage discussion series. I co-host this with Emily Cloyd, who, as I just mentioned, for the first time ever, is actually on video, so you can see her. Say hi, Emily.
Hello. And I may be joined by my cat. We'll see. She likes to sit on my shoulder when I'm on the webcam.
Excellent. So this week we have this month, a very interesting discussion, and it's best for me because I don't have to do very much. I just have to kick it over to Brooke and let her take things over. I will say, if you're not speaking, please mute yourself, and then you can unmute yourself as you come along. So, Brooke, take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, good morning, afternoon, everybody. I see a number of you, and I see a number of names I know and a number of names that I don't know, so I'm very excited to have us all be connecting together. I am Brooke Smith with the Kavli Foundation. I'm the Director of Public Engagement with Science here, and we are going to talk today for the next hour about some work that we did last year that involved many of these beautiful smiling faces that you see on video. We had a initiative called Support Systems for Scientists, Communication and Engagement. And this was a year-long initiative series that we at the Kavli Foundation did in partnership with the Rita Allen Foundation, the Packard Foundation, and the Moore Foundation, and honorary partners at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative as well. And what we were aiming to do was to better understand some of the more systemic challenges or opportunities that are helping or getting in the way of scientists being supported to engage and communicate. The way we defined it was effectively and sustainably, with the idea that a lot of scientists are starting to do engagement or have been doing it for a while, but whether or not they're doing it effectively is a question that has come up, and whether or not they can do it sustainably. Do they have the support and resources that they need to do so? So the question we posed at the beginning of this initiative is, well, how can we do it effectively? How can we do it sustainably? Are we doing it? And if we're not doing it effectively and sustainably, what are some of the things we can do to try to get to that place? So what we did, the way we approached this, is we had a series of convenings to discuss some of these topics. So we had 4 convenings over the course of a year. Each convening brought together what we consider to be different kinds of people that provide a critical role in supporting scientists in doing this work, and to have discussions then amongst themselves about what they see going on in the field, what they see as top priorities. One of the things we did, which I thought was incredibly useful, and we'll share some links to this in the text box on the side, is in partnership with the Rita Allen Foundation. And I don't know if Elizabeth from Rita Allen is on the phone with us today. I don't see your name, but there's so many names here that maybe she is. We worked to commission some landscape reports before each workshop and discussion that we had. We had some experts, many of them who will share some of their thoughts today, do some landscaping to understand what is going on in this space and what do we know and what do we see happening, so that we could have more informed conversations. So we thought on this discussion today for the next hour, we would share some of the things that we learned and discussed in that series. And it was intentionally pretty small workshops, like 30 to 40 people. And so we definitely consider them to be hopefully mostly representative, but definitely not exhausted. And we're excited for those of you that are on the phone today that hadn't participated in those workshops to hear what we talked about, and we'd love to hear your feedback about things we missed or things from your experience that you want to put on the table, because we see this as an ongoing discussion. And then we're going to spend a little time at the end of our discussion this hour talking about some of the things that are happening as a result of the discussions that we've had. So for those of you on the phone who were part of our workshops and are interested in plugging into some of those things, we'll talk about those. And this is just an opportunity. When we were talking to Jeff and Emily about this, we really want this to be a discussion and a conversation amongst us all. We are not showing slides. We're not giving presentations. We're going to kind of talk about themes. This is not a talk at you and then have question and answers at the end. So please raise your hand or chime in on the text box if you want to ask any questions as we're covering things or as we're going deeper into some of the observations and discussions that we had. The other thing I'd quickly say before we lay out what we discussed and some of the major themes we saw is I do think that one of the things that was really interesting about this workshop series is even though it was really about how we're supporting scientists in their communication and engagement, it was hard to have that conversation without talking just generally about how science is connected to people, whether that's through other means of communication and engagement that may or may not directly include scientists. So we kind of bleed more generally into that broader view for sure. So in some ways, I really see this as a great opportunity to have this larger community talk and connect together to think about more, where's the field going? And so I know a lot of these SciEngage webinars have been about specific projects or specific aspects of the field, which is great. And I think this one will be a big zoom out to really be thinking about what's happening across the whole field and what are some ways that we collectively can push that forward. So I am just going to give 5 minutes of an overview of what we saw as the biggest lessons and biggest take-homes in this workshop series. We'll link to some reports and more information in the text window in a moment. And then I'm going to invite our folks who are with us who did the landscape reports for each of the workshops to reflect on those major priorities and share some of their thoughts about what they saw through the landscape reports or things that might have been specific to the field they were landscaping. So the 4 workshops that we had were, the first one was with communication trainers, science communication trainers, people who provide communication training. The second was folks at scientific societies that support their members in communication and engagement work. And that was really interesting because we worked across all kinds of societies, big, small, natural science, social science, the whole gamut. The third were people at universities and on campuses that provide support for folks at those institutions. And then the fourth was about what we called facilitators of engagement. So individuals at all kinds of institutions, whether it's a nonprofit, a for-profit, a museum, a university, a boundary organization. So folks who help support scientists in connecting with different audiences that might range from school groups to policymakers to journalists. So that kind of whole gamut of facilitators of engagement or connectors, the boundary space. So after these series of discussions, I would say that we observed 2 things really strongly, kind of 2 big buckets of things. The first was a huge appetite from folks in these discussions to have a stronger community amongst them. And I think one of the things that these workshops did was bring people together who probably had heard about each other, or maybe you were Twitter friends, but you hadn't actually yet connected with each other. And we saw then that there was a lot of interest and commonality in that connectivity amongst folks. And we saw it broadly across all of this work with the idea that even though I work with kids and you work with policymakers, we have some things in common, and maybe we could work together or connect together to address challenges or to share resources. So really seeing opportunities to do some what we called like meta connecting across the field to both improve the flow of information so that as those of you who are doing this great work or research can share it with folks faster so that there's faster learning and uptake in the community, but also recognizing that if the community were stronger and more cohesive, that the community itself could play a really impactful role on moving the system forward in places that we might want to see it improve, such as making sure scientists are rewarded and acknowledged for this work, making sure that we have access to social science research to inform the kinds of things we do. So we saw that at the meta level for sure, but we also saw it at kind of 2 sub-levels, I would say. The science communication training community definitely had a large appetite to make sure that they were connected and becoming more of an actual community, and we'll talk a bit about that later. And that the scientific society folks also saw great potential in sharing resources, but working collectively to have some more collective impact in their influence over the culture of science to push towards a culture that better supports and rewards and acknowledges the importance of this work within science. So that first bucket I would call building community, and we're starting to do some things in that space that we'll talk about in a bit. The second bucket I'd call more areas, priority areas that if we address will help this system become stronger, more sustainable, and more effective. And so these were things that every workshop talked about in terms of how can we make what we're doing in science engagement and communication in supporting scientists specifically, but in the field more generally, stronger. And there were 4 themes that came up over and over again. And so I'm just going to quickly tick off what those themes are, and then I'll invite folks to share their thoughts and invite folks who did the landscape reports to go a little deeper into some of these themes. So the first theme was recognizing that we really need to put some effort into shifting this paradigm within science so that it's about the communities and the audiences first, as opposed to the content first. And this was really born from, of course, recognition about the deficit model being the predominant way of doing communication and engagement in the world, and that in fact science and the culture of science might in some ways support that type of work. And so how do we kind of shift that paradigm so it's not about your content pushing out into the world, but how do you listen and work with communities and hear what communities are thinking about and working on? The second piece was acknowledging, and I'm sure you've all talked about this many times, that the culture within higher education really needs to shift pretty quickly to start supporting and acknowledging and valuing this type of work, both the scientists who might do communication engagement, but also the professionals who play a role at these boundary spaces or provide that support either for scientists or if they're doing science and engagement in different ways, that is a valued and recognized profession within the science culture. The third piece that we had talked about was making sure that our science engagement and communication spaces are diverse and inclusive, acknowledging that who is doing the communicating, who is supporting that communicating and engaging, and the audiences that we're connecting with really should be reflecting the whole of our society right now. And the communication training community, for example, tends to be predominantly white and female. Scientists who are out there engaging tend to be the more senior white males. So how can we shift that so the places that we're actually doing communication and engagement are diverse and inclusive of our world? And lastly, the fourth piece is recognizing that there is a ton of great research about good communication, engagement, audiences, cognitive behavior, and it's often not connected to the practice that people are doing. And I know this is something that we talk about a lot in this space, but the landscape reports really elucidated it in terms of people in the field saying, I just don't have time to connect to social science. I don't really care about social science. So that was a very eye-opening part of what we learned. So I'm going to stick into the text window. We have a page on CASE's website, and I know Jamie Bell and Melissa I saw on the phone too have been great in helping to create a space for all these resources to go up there. So I'll stick that in the window right now. I'd like to invite the folks who did our landscape reports, and we'll go one by one to share some remarks and comments about what you learned in the landscaping for the communities that you did. And if folks want to chime in or have questions, you can either shout out and we'll hear you, or type in the text window and we'll know to ask, because we really want to hear any thoughts or reflections as we move forward. So I'll kick it over to Anthony Dudo and John Besley, who did the landscape about the communication trainers, and hear what kinds of thoughts they have after doing the landscape and participating in some of these conversations. John and Anthony?
Sure, well, I'll start us off. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Okay, wonderful. John and I had great fun doing this. We actually did a round of interviews with the communication training folks in 2014 as part of an NSF grant, and then we're lucky enough to come back in 2017 and have these conversations again with an even expanded group of folks. And I think before I launch into just a couple key top-line takeaways that really struck us, I will just say that the level of passion and enthusiasm and energy among this cohort of folks in the science engagement space was palpable. And so we had trouble getting people off the phone during our interviews, which is a really noteworthy thing. I'll just kind of cruise through a couple key findings that we had, and this will echo a little bit what Brooke had mentioned. there was a very intense desire for more interaction among folks in this space. There tended to be a handful of communication training programs that the folks we interviewed could identify, but there was really an overall kind of lack of awareness of who is doing what in the space, and a real intense desire to understand who's doing what and how they can connect in meaningful ways. So again, this initiative helped start to establish those connections, which was great and something that's really strongly desired by this community. A very low level of competition emerged from the interviews, and a very high level of desire for cooperation emerged instead. We were really interested, and this extended back to the work we did, the interviews we did in 2014, where John and I were really interested in the kind of the content of the curricula that the trainers were focused on, and specifically what were they covering, what were they talking about and focused on. And we found in 2014, and again we found in 2017, that overall the focus was largely on what we call tactics. So helping scientists do very specific things like remove jargon or tell stories or give elevator pitches or design good PowerPoint slides. And as opposed to a focus being more strategic. So what kinds of goals are you trying to accomplish? What kinds of communication objectives do you have? What kind of tactics are going to help you get there? Just for the record, there are exceptions to this overarching finding. The good news is that there are absolutely folks in the training space who are really innovative in terms of what their curricula look like. And so we view that from where we sit as a really promising thing. There was, I think, immense opportunity for more synergy between the folks in the communication training space with the folks who do research on science communication, right down to identifying really important research questions or hypotheses that the community needs to suss out and doesn't have the time, the money, or the expertise to do on its own. And so we think, John and I, and Shu Pei as well, on our end, we've talked about this a great deal, that there's a huge onus on the academic community to make itself more available, more interested, and ready to play with the practitioners when it comes to thinking about the communication training space, and that means a great deal to us. Another thing, and Brooke mentioned this too, and I'll stop talking, is, you know, we were really interested in, well, who's getting trained and who's doing the training, and who are the folks who are being trained to engage with. And overall, again, we see that it's pretty darn homogenous in that regard. And there's a lot of work to do in that area. The good news is that the folks we talk to are really aware of this. And again, very mindful and hoping to move on and think about how we can kind of diversify who has access to the training, who's doing the training, and who we're training scientists to engage with. And last but certainly not least is the question we were very interested in is, how do we know if our training works? And again, we're, as a community, very aware that there's a lot of work to be done on evaluation and identifying, you know, when and in which context our training is most likely to work. How do we measure that? It's, for a number of really, I think, you know, important logistical reasons, really hard to do that type of evaluation. Again, the good news is, I would argue, even in the last, you know, 12 to 18 months since this initiative really started, we start to see a lot more partnerships, and we see a lot more publications and reports focused on this exact issue. I know certainly a number of us are involved in those partnerships now, and I think that is just an awesome thing to see and to emerge from this kind of big collective effort. Those are the big hitters that I wanted to mention. John, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on to that.
So the only one that I would add, I guess, that I've been thinking a lot about is the question of individual focus. So much of the training is very focused on training individual scientists to do individual things, rather than, if you think about other types of communication where you're trying to coordinate a bunch of people to have a common goal and common messages. And so that's one thing that, and I think that's a function a little bit of the nature of the type of training we have, of what's possible. I'm sure lots of folks would love to do more collaborative, more sort of organizational communication work. But when we think about effectiveness, it's worth thinking about how can we make so that all these individual efforts are more than just individual efforts, but that they add up to something cumulative. Excellent.
Anyone have a thought or a question or an observation that they want to share about what John and Anthony are sharing before we move on to some of the other reflections?
This is Kat Stilinski.
Hi, Kat.
I have, hi, how you doing, Brooke? I have one reflection, thinking about it from the education community. That is not uncommon that we see in developing education programs, that there can be a focus on, Anthony talked about the focus on tactics, sort of, these are the sort of specific things we're going to do with them, rather than the bigger, well, where do we want, how are we going to help them figure out where they ultimately want to go with whatever communication they're doing? And this happens a lot in K-12 and within formal. There's, oh, I have this great tool, I have this great resource, I have this wonderful, I have a GPS, so I'm going to focus on these cool activities. And, this is where backward design comes from, like thinking about, well, what is it you're trying to achieve when they're done, when the lesson's done? What will they walk away with? What were the big ideas? So it's nice to hear those parallels.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for saying that. And I think that's another great point about making sure we're all learning from each other, even though we might go to different meetings or have different identities, because there's a lot of shared things to benefit from. Anyone else? All right, I'm going to turn it over to Shu Pei Yoon, who did the landscape report with John and Anthony's help as well, and she led this around what scientific societies are doing to support their members in this space. So Shu Pei, high-level reflections about what we saw as our top priorities, or other things that you felt like were particularly interesting to societies that are worth highlighting here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Brooke. So Anthony, John, and I, we did 2 projects related to societies' support for public engagement. We did an interview with 21 societies and another following up survey with 76 societies. So one thing we found interesting is throughout these 2 projects, we were able to identify what kind of support societies are providing, including society's own practice, such as managing their website or social media account or their own publications, events initiated by societies with participants of their members, and also just their support for individual members' engagement, such as the trainings John and Anthony did before. One thing we found interesting is public engagement is valued highly by societies as well. And when we asked them about the objectives they have for public engagement, we did find some interesting difference between society key actors and individual scientists. A couple of years ago, John, Anthony, and I, we did a survey with society members, so individual scientists asking how they value different types of objectives. What we found is the most prioritized objective is still related to educational, informational, they wanted to inform the public, trying to defend science. But when we did this survey with society members, society key actors, we found that the really top objectives are related to organizational level, how to inform policymakers, how to inform the public about the transparency of the scientific community. So that difference, we found that's something interesting we noticed through the different projects. Another thing we noticed is many society have put a lot of effort into public engagement, including organizing different activities. But one thing they have recognized and are working on right now is also setting up specific objectives they can achieve, what kind of goals they wanted to have throughout different activities, which is also highly relevant to the evaluations they have. If you don't have a very clear objective, your evaluation is going to be very general, and probably just a customer satisfaction survey kind of thing. So that's one thing societies mentioning a lot that they are working on, and trying to have a way to evaluate their public engagement effort overall instead of just towards specific events as well. So anything else, John, Anthony, you would like to add?
Or anyone else that was there with us that has other reflections from the conversations we had about this work that Shu Pei elucidated during our workshop? We had definitely seen 2 really powerful things that I wanted to share that I mentioned briefly. One was when Shu Pei said that they compared objectives that societies have in supporting scientists in this work to previous research they've done about objectives that scientists have in this work. It was very eye-opening to see that those objectives they didn't really match up, which is interesting. There was only one objective that they shared in common, which was both societies and scientists, their least, their smallest priority objective was making sure they're listening to communities. So that was like, when we had that conversation in that room, the whole room was like, oh my gosh, this is not okay. And so that I felt like was a very pivotal moment for the room. And then the second thing I would say too is just also at that discussion, it was a really great discussion where societies, I think, had a lot of will and excitement about working together to collectively do something in this space, and that they're more powerful together. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the things we're doing there. Other thoughts or questions about that?
Oh, one thing I would like to add is we actually published the first part of the project, the interview study already. So if anyone's interested in it, I'm happy to share it with you guys.
Great. I'm peeking at the chat window too. Yes. Valerie, I see your question. Let's talk about it in a few minutes, because we're going to touch on it a little bit when we talk about the universities and some of the facilitators. That's a great question. So I'm gonna table it and bring it back in a few minutes. Anything else about specifically about societies? Of course, we can come back to this. Okay. So on our university discussion, and I see a few folks on the call who were at our university workshop, Julie Rissian from Oregon State did this landscape study, and she unfortunately had a dental emergency procedure this morning and is not on the call with us today. I'm going to put her landscape report here in the window. I would say that what she did was she did focus group conversations with different people who play roles at universities in supporting scientists. So she had online focus groups of VPRs, of graduate students, of PIOs, of deans, of all kinds of different folks to kind of understand where they're seeing the potential and where they're seeing some of the challenges. And I think one of the things that was most interesting from her work that we all saw, and I invite any of you who were there to reflect on this, is just the disconnect between some of the lip service that might happen in university missions about being service-oriented or for the community, but then the feeling of the faculty and graduate students just not really feeling supported in that way, and not really feeling like the resources are being put behind some of the calls to action. And of course, this is, again, not true for every university institution, and there are many that are doing great things. And something that we see in this whole space is all of these trends we see. There are bright spots that are not following those trends, which is really exciting. But certainly, Julie also talked about where the rubber meets the road is at the department level and with the chairs, and that's something that we should be focusing a bit on. So I would love to hear from anyone who was at that workshop in terms of perspectives they had and why you're thinking about that. I think the conversation that's happening between Billy and Emily on the side, if you all are seeing it in the text one, is a really, really interesting one, and I'd love some of your thoughts on it. I think when we had these different workshops, there was a feeling that societies could do more and move faster and have greater influence more quickly than universities could. That was the discussion we had, for sure. And bright spots in academia, I think Julie and Emily, who's here, who's an expert in this, can share some of those things as well. Any other thoughts about this thread going on the side, and or more thoughts about universities from folks that were there?
I can chime in if
please.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we have found at AAAS is we have the ability to recognize individuals who are doing really wonderful things, and we can help sort of pollinate or spread ideas between institutions. So we can, for example, with our Leshner Leadership Institute, hold up people who are doing a really great job of public engagement, who are working with their colleagues, with their students to do more engagement. And for them, having that ability to go to their university and say, hey, I'm a AAAS Leshner Leadership Fellow, that gives them currency. But they still have to, at their institution, move the needle. So while they can say, hey, I need a little bit more time, I need a little bit more recognition of my engagement, because I have this label, they can maybe get that. But then getting the university to sort of pick that up and help other faculty, other students do it can sometimes be a really heavy lift. But we've also found fellows who are able to sort of really move the needle because they had a little bit more buy-in from their chair or administrators. And because they could bring those examples that they learned in their society.
Mm-hmm.
I would just weigh in a little bit more on societies versus universities. I mean, I think one of the big differences we see in our society is in the universities, a lot of these efforts are very siloed and they're small. And even though it's expanded a lot, people still feel isolated in their community. They might be the one person or the one or two people in the department that really care about it. But when they come together in the society, it does allow for a larger network across, across institutions, which I think is really a significant strength in the scientific societies. One of the interesting things that I've been seeing is it also, Brooke mentioned that there, in both the societies and the universities, there's little spots of kind of bright spots. And what I have been sort of seeing is people learn where those bright spots are, and then they try to get jobs in those bright spots. So we do see, like, there's some departments that encourage this, and they actually get more and more people that do this. And that's not necessarily a great thing, because then they're kind of getting clustered together. But I've seen a lot of that happening as well, as people are like, well, my department's okay with this. And it's like, well, maybe I should look and go over and do my postdoc there. Or maybe, it's like other people are trying to kind of find their way. So I do think it'll be interesting to see how that kind of movement, through scientific societies and the network might affect universities, and whether we do start getting more kind of clustered, where it gets stronger and stronger, because you get that kind of effect of people right there. It may just be anecdotal, but.
Yeah.
Brooke, if I could jump in and follow along with this, since Compass has been doing trainings for a while now, right? We have folks who we trained 10, 15 years ago who are now in positions of relative power within a university or agency context. And so the ability of those folks to make change within their institutions is pretty powerful. And so when you see this transformation over time of people who are now leaders, that their ability to spread the model out within their institution, I think, is really great. It's a slow way of making change, right? And we would love for that change to accelerate, but you are seeing these effects over time.
And I think the value of things like the training programs that Compass does, that AAAS does, where we're bringing together people from different institutions and creating some cohorts so that they have, they have that connection to people outside of their institution, and they can also point to other institutions that are doing some great things and sort of even get it a little competitive between institutions and say, hey, look at what this one is doing, look at what this one is doing. So I think when we can bring people together from different institutions through societies, through organizations like Compass, that's so helpful.
I totally agree, Emily. It's the power of the mutual support network and learning, like, how did you make change within your institution, right? All of those are really important lessons that for mutual learning and support across a cohort are just amazing.
Okay, I want to just transition to hear from Darcy, because I think he's got some things that can fuel this conversation too, and then we can follow up on some of these threads that are happening as well and go deeper on this. So Darcy and Ira, I don't know if Ira's on the phone from ASU, worked to do our final landscape report about facilitators of engagement. So Darcy, reflections on the conversations we're having or the top priorities and what you saw when you dug deep into the diverse community of folks who do facilitating and connection?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Brooke. Ira does send his regrets not being able to meet today, so I'm going to represent 4 authors on this report, 3 from Arizona State University, so that was Ira, along with a graduate student, Stephen Weiner, and Darlene Kavli. And so I'm an independent consultant who was brought in to help with this effort. And so to represent first what Ira had wanted to say is that part of the reason Arizona State University was so attracted to this landscape report is that the School for the Future of Innovation and Society that Ira and Darlene are both faculty in, and Stephen is a graduate student, they do both programming and research into the nature of public engagement. And so they're still very active in that role since the year has gone by. So I wanted to say that the top observation of the many, but the one I want to sort of focus on is this 70-10-10 ratio, as it were. So that's 70-10-10, and I'll come back to what that stands for in a second. So as Brooke said, this was the group of facilitators, those who sort of handshake scientists with publics. And it ranged from those who just do a simple matchmaking, here's a scientist who wants to engage a public, okay, off you go, to those who are managing an entire event, or perhaps a program within an institution where there's ongoing scientist-public interaction. And we invited 30 people. We had 20 interviewees, and they clustered into essentially 7 categories by audience or venue as we defined them. So this was audiences that were from civic groups, those from the policy world or decision makers, formal educators / classrooms, media, which includes online video, and then a super category of informal science education venues, which we broke into 3 of sort of adult / intelligent nightlife programming, science centers, museums, aquaria, zoos, etc., and then youth programming. And I will say too that some of the interviewees were hybrids within that. So for example, a museum that has an adult-facing program. Now, the big challenge of all of these results was because of this diversity, the data was very difficult to say, well, here's what an average facilitator is like. Because, say, comparing a youth programming to someone in the policy space, both want to get more science conversation happening, but it's really difficult to compare those. So instead of giving averages of responses and trend analysis, although we have that at the top level, there's a lot of qualitative data there. And so the report has a ton of verbatim quotes from the interviewees. So you can read their words as to how they describe their successes and challenges. So I think that's a great value in the report. So this 70-10-10 number, that represents the backgrounds of the facilitators. So 70% of the facilitators have an academic science degree, 55% of which have an advanced degree, so a master's or a PhD. And only 10% have a communications or education background. So the balance are from the humanities, that sort of thing. But only 10% of the total number of facilitators, i.e. 2 out of 20, are still, or at least at the time of the interviewing, were presently active researchers. So what this tells us is that these facilitators come from the scientists that they're putting in contact with the publics, but the facilitators themselves are no longer, or at least in the majority, active in that sphere. So the facilitators themselves are somewhat of a hybrid between the audiences they're reaching and the scientists they're working with. And that strikes me as speaking to these cohorts of academically trained scientists who then leave the field, as it were, and that contributes to there being a disparate network of like-minded individuals who may have individually developed best practices, high skill sets, etc., but they feel isolated from others of like-minded interests. And that also speaks to the ongoing sort of recruitment of good facilitators and the support for those who are perhaps early career or even students who see themselves going into this facilitator career role, and yet feeling that they have to go away from where they've been nurturing their skills in order to do that. So that's where I'll leave things, and I look forward to discussing.
Thanks, Darcy. Someone had a question for you in the chat window asking about when you're saying active researchers, do you mean in science or in science communications / education?
Yes, I meant in active sort of research science. So, for example, say an academic who is just hypothetically a meteorologist at some university who's doing outreach. We found that an extreme minority of the respondents. And I would include with that industry scientists and federal or even state scientists as well. So these are not quote unquote practicing scientists in the majority.
Yeah. Great. I would love to just very quickly do a quick round of a few folks that joined us to talk about some of the work that they're doing in better connecting and building these networks. And if Amanda and Laura and Kristen and Erica, who I'll ask to do that in just a second, if you guys could just give a really high-level, fast overview, because I think what would be really interesting is knowing that some of those connections are starting to happen and we're building out some more capacity to make them happen. The conversation that's happening in the text box is exactly the kinds of things that these communities are going to want to listen to and help connect those of you who are already thinking about it and working on advance. And so I would love to make sure we're spending some time on that, because it'll help us and help those of you who are moving some of this thinking forward connect more broadly with all of you on this call and all of your peers in this space. So really quickly, as I had said, because of acknowledging that we really saw a need for more connectivity in this space, and people had a lot in common but might not be connected or sharing resources, and or there's potential for more action if we have a cohesive whole of folks working on kind of pushing the system in some of these places that we're talking about here on the side. A few things that are underway. There are three that we'll highlight quickly. Kristen Dorgalo is here with us from Aztec, and she is working with a group of folks from different networks to try to do more to connect all the networks that exist in this space for different reasons with each other. Laura Lindenfeld and Amanda are working on building the training community. And then Erica and some of her peers at AAAS, Emily's on the phone, and folks at AGU and Research America are working in the scientific society space. So if we could just hear from each of you for a few minutes about what you have planned and what's ahead, just for context, and then we can maybe dig in more to some of these great meaty topics on the side, because it's what you're going to be working on. Kristen, would you start?
Sure, happy to, and it's so great to be hearing about each of these discussions and having had a chance to be part of it. You know, one of the things that came out of the facilitators conversation and other conversations was this idea that science engagement networks could be better connected, and that one way that we might do that is to create an opportunity for network leaders that support institutions and people involved in science engagement to be better connected. And so following last October's meeting of a set of those networks supported by Kavli Foundation and the other foundations. With the support of Kavli, we've been able to pull together a design team of representative groups that are thinking about what the role of an emerging network of science engagement network leaders might be. And so we're thinking through what the purpose of getting together on a regular basis might be, what principles are that might govern how we work together. Like, what do we share in common? For example, when Brooke was talking about some of the common threads that came out of those conversations, this commitment to putting communities first and our thoughts around, the importance of diverse and inclusive approaches have to ground the way we work together as essentially a meta network, if this is to really reflect the shared areas of interest of the group. And so together we're thinking through a network charter that might govern the creation of this network of science engagement network leaders. We're thinking through those principles, and we're thinking about what collective action might be, not just group learning, towards the priority areas that came out of the series of conversations that we just reviewed. And so what are those collective action opportunities where we could really move the lever, whether it's on community first or on diversity and inclusion or on changing higher ed culture? And how do we think about participation so that this reflects our open and inclusive approaches and makes sure that the voices that are around the table in this conversation can be part of that work, so that a broad set of networks can be part of that work? And then what's the ongoing backbone that would help to support engagement between and among the networks that sustains itself over time? So is there a set of tools for exchanging information and ideas? Are there regular times when science engagement network leaders should get together? And we're really grateful to all of the networks that have been part of giving input and are now entering a phase where, upon drafting a network charter, we'll be able to really socialize that and get feedback from the broader community and make sure we're heading in a direction that makes sense. And just really excited about the potential and already seeing, as I think Tony Dudo mentioned, those connections emerging around shared work happening now. So this idea that we could learn together, but also that we could take action together to move the needle on some of these priority action areas. So really grateful to Kavli to continue to support us all in thinking this through.
Thanks, Kristen. You're gonna have to, if you want to ask a question, you have to just jump right in because I can't see everyone or hands. So feel free to just jump in and interrupt if you want to say something.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering if Erica Kimmerling on the line would add anything that I might have missed in her reflections on that work. Putting her on the spot.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I'm actually at a direct-to-consumer genomics conference, so my brain back in. No, I actually, Kristen, I think you did a great job of summarizing the conversations that we've been having. And one thing I think in the conversations and drafting the charter really stands out is that we're taking a bigger picture perspective and framing how we're going to approach this network. So this idea of nurturing all people's partnerships with science is really the core mission of this network. I think really speaks a lot to the type of work that it's going to do. So I wanted to reiterate that point.
Thanks, Erica.
Yeah, and I also think we would really welcome feedback from any of you about your thoughts about where that network of science engagement network leaders might head to be most effective and impactful. And I know you can reach out to Brooke, Erica, or me with any feedback or ideas, and we'll be reaching out to a lot of you to get your feedback in the coming months.
Yeah, I'm going to put yours and Erica's contact in the chat window. Okay, great. Laura and Amanda, can you talk a little bit about, I feel like we could have a whole separate hour SciEngage discussion on the communication trainer webinar. We might want to do that, or the communication training community, but give us the highlights of what's happening in terms of community building for people who do trainers, and make sure we're connecting with folks here who want to be part of that.
Yes. I'll kick things off and then let Laura jump in, and I'll try to be super brief on this and acknowledging the time and all the information we've gotten so far in this webinar. So Laura and I have been working with Kavli and CZI and Converge partners on building a SciComm training network for learning and action. This is really a community to advance science communication training. So trainers, researchers who study training, practitioners who really care about science training. It's all about training better communicators and leaders. I'm going to put a link to a blog post in the chat window that gives sort of an overview of the work to date, of where we are. We had a summit in December where we brought a bunch of people together to start those initial conversations about how do we form a community, what is the purpose, and all that sort of work. We have a draft charter a draft network formation plan. We're gaining feedback from folks right now that will help us refine those documents, leading up to a network launch convening this October. In addition to the blog post I'll put in the chat window, if you scroll down to the bottom, if this is something you want to learn more about, if you want to be a part of this community of trainers, or I would say it's bigger than trainers, but this community to advance communication training, and are interested in sort of following along with what's going on with this emerging network, there's a link to a Google form where you can submit your information about how you want to be involved. And I'll also put in email. We have a Gmail address, the SciComm Training Network at gmail.com. I'll put that in there and you can reach out to us. Laura, anything to chime in?
Yeah, I'll just say hello, everyone. There's an incredible appetite to collaborate in this community. And I think from Amanda and my perspective, we see it as a great big community of leaders who want to advance this forward together. We're very grateful for the support we've gotten from Kavli and CZI and others to move this forward. This community is really invested in linking research with practice and making sure that what we do is underscored by the very same standards of science we seek to support. But we are really committed to formalizing and growing this network together with you and others. That's it for me.
Yeah, I see that Arna and Kishore, I believe, are on the line from Chan Zuckerberg, who have been enormous partners in making this happen, and really have a wonderful commitment to building community as we do at the Kavli Foundation. And it's really special to be able to have this partnership with CZI and Amanda and Laura to all be working together and building community and providing space and resources to bring people together and have kinds of discussions to connect across is really appreciated. Arna or Kishore, do you want to add anything as we're talking about this?
We're reflecting what you said, and Laura and Amanda, we're just really excited to help support this community and come together. And as Amanda said, to broader, just not the trainers, but everyone that's involved with training scientists in different forms of communication. So really excited to see where this goes this year, and getting people together in October for a launch event. So.
Excellent. All right, let's turn it over to Erica Shugart and Emily, who's here too, to talk a bit about the Civic Science Fellow at the Societies. And I know Barbara is on the line from the Rita Allen Foundation, who has been a leader in creating the broader Civic Science Fellow program. So we can connect to that. And if you want to add anything, Barbara, please chime in too. Erica.
Sure. So we're really delighted to have funding from the Kavli Foundation to be able to support work for a Civic Science Fellow. And I noticed there was some in the chat box, some discussion of SciComm versus public engagement versus all of that. Civic science is a term that is meant to be an umbrella that encompasses the breadth of those activities. So, so kind of if you're thinking, is it in there? It probably is, but about, we had a lot of discussion about what to call it, and that was a piece of it. So there's been already a lot of interaction between societies. There's a real history here of collaboration between the societies to think about how we can share best practices, how we can enhance the work that we're doing. But it's challenging because each one of us is basically in our silo, kind of heads down, focused on our work. And it's hard to get the bandwidth to do something that's broader than that. So having a fellow come in, and this is, we do have an 18-month fellowship. It has recently been posted. I'll put the link over here to come in and really one of the things we're focused on is how to improve the collective impact of societies, to look and help us think about, what is that overarching agenda that we want to accomplish. So there was been discussion about that we're kind of focused on, well, let's teach people this or that. It's like content driven. It is, kind of those questions of how do we get the community so we're more community driven, more audience driven. Look at the actions that the societies are taking. Most of us have a general portfolio of kind of things that are overlapping. And how can we synergize those activities so that we can do them better, so we can get our members more engaged, all of those things that we're kind of talking about. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to come in. This is administratively housed in ASCB, but it is guided and steered by a group that includes AAAS, Emily, AGU, Research America. Brooke is very, very involved along the way. And then this is part of the larger fellowship, which Barbara can talk about. It is a fellow that will be one among several fellows that Rita Allen have been funding. So we're really excited that we'll also be able to tap into other networks. I think the fact that we have networks, tapping into networks is exciting, because I do think that the work societies are doing has kind of hit that point where it's ready to tip over from a bunch of individual efforts to a larger collective effort. And I'm excited that we're going to have someone that can help us do that. And I don't know if Emily or Brooke, you want to add more details that you think are important to emphasize, but
Emily, you want to add anything?
I think I'm just very excited about this because while some societies have internal capacity to do engagement and science communication and support their scientists, other societies are quite small and they're using maybe more of a volunteer model. Others might have only one person, while some have 2 or 3. So I really think that having this position will help us sort of look at the landscape across societies and evaluate how we can learn from and help one another. So I think this is a great chance for us to have somebody who's a little bit more external actually look at all of the different things that we're all doing and hopefully create some resources that might be useful for societies that are a little bit newer or are relying on different models for supporting their scientists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really exciting to hear all of these things happening and to be on this call with all of you. I can't even see all of you, and I'm clicking through like many pages of faces. And what's interesting is Jeff was at our facilitator discussion, and when we talked about the fact that there were lots of people, is it SciComm, is it SciEngage, what do we call it? But we all have something in common. Jeff was the one who said, let's just go start a webinar where we invite everyone in. And that's actually where this discussion series was born from, which was really exciting. But I feel like, from someone who's been in this community a bit, and I'm sure some of you feel like this too, the energy to have the community be stronger and more connected and more professional is palpable. And it feels like it's taking us towards a tipping point for some of these things we care about. And I think that's really obvious in all these things that those of you have talked about, and just the great discussion happening on the side and who's joining the call. So this is leaving me feeling really excited about the state of the field right now to see all of you and all of this energy. Any overarching thoughts based on this really big field-wide view we just gave? And I see some appetite to go down into some more specific discussions. Maybe we can have be future webinars, Emily and Jeff, if folks are interested in it. But field-wide views, given this big zooming out we've done the past hour, I'd love to hear from folks. I see lots of names that I don't know that I'd love to hear from you.
Hi, this is Kishore. The one thing that's really sticking out to me is what I think John said about the homogeneity of the group. I think that's the one that's going to give me some sleepless nights. And really wanting to understand like how we can move beyond that as a group. I don't think there's a single solution there, but I'd love to see much more critical thought and ideas emerge in that space, because I think we can all agree that bringing more diverse perspectives into this group is going to result in a lot of new ideas and new strategies in place.
There's a lot of heads nodding on video.
Yeah,
You're not
sure. I wholeheartely agree. And just, as Kishore knows this, but just for all of you, is one of the things we're really thinking about within the SciComm training network, is really thinking about both how we diversify the field of who does science communication training, thinking about how we make those trainings more inclusive, thinking about who we're training and who we're training them to engage with. And so that's definitely one of the common goals that the entire community of people involved in this emerging network hold really strongly as a fundamental purpose of why this network needs to exist.
Mm-hmm. And just like that, I see we're at 10 o'clock. I know we want to be really respectful of everybody's time. If there's any of these things we've talked about that you want to plug into, We put some contact information in the chat window. If you're not sure who to contact, just contact me. I will put my contact information in the chat window right now, and I'll get you to the right person. And if you have any thoughts, or you feel like we talked about something that you have a additional perspective you want us to put in the mix as we're developing all these communities, we would love to hear from you. So please consider this an open invitation to be part of how we're thinking about this and how we're developing ideas. And thank you, Jeff and Emily, for creating this space for us all to connect across all these different identities and terminologies.
Absolutely. So I will just take this chance to say thank you to Brooke and to everyone else who contributed both to the meetings that were taking place last year, who were part of the initiatives going forward, and were all of you for being part of this discussion. I second Brooke's thought, and we've actually been chatting like privately while this is going on, saying like, wouldn't these all be great discussions on their own? So I will be reaching out to all of you to have some of these future discussions, because I think there can be a lot more that we can get into. I will say that this discussion will be posted online. The chat will be saved. It will be also posted online. That website that is hosted on the SSS website will have the information, and we also have the ability through the Trellis portal to have some more discussion, so that it's not just Brooke getting 1,000 emails from everyone and trying to share it with all of them. So I will be sending out information about that, but thank you all for your time and your input, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Emily. Happy weekend, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Nice to see you all.
Thank you.